Imagine this. You're lying awake at night, the ceiling darker than your thoughts, and your brain starts running its favorite series again. One episode about an awkward conversation, the next about the future, the third about what you could have said differently 5 years ago. Your body is tense, you're breathing shallow, and inside there's this feeling like you're late for your own life. Even though you're not going anywhere, you call it anxiety. That's what you were taught to call it. From childhood, from conversations, from the internet, from other people's diagnoses. Anxious means weak. It means insecure. It means something's wrong with your mind. And you get used to thinking of yourself as defective, too sensitive, too thoughtful, too reactive. But here's a question almost no one asks. What if the problem isn't that you feel too much, but that you have nowhere to use it? What if your mind isn't broken, but overloaded? Like a powerful engine kept idling all the time, and everyone wonders why it overheats. You notice details, you read tone, you feel tension in a room before anyone says a word. You think ahead, run scenarios, try to prepare for life like an exam with no tickets. And instead of calling that a resource, you call it a problem. The strangest part is that anxiety doesn't completely paralyze you. You live, you work, you talk, you laugh. But inside, there's a constant sense that you're holding something powerful under a lid. Like there's energy there, but it's not allowed to come out. And the longer you keep it contained, the more pressure builds from the inside. In this video, we're going to do one dangerous thing. We'll stop treating you like you're broken, and we'll try to understand what's really happening in your mind. Because sometimes anxiety isn't a weakness. It's strength that was never allowed to be strength. Most likely, you've already tried a lot. Box breathing, distracting yourself, not thinking about the bad things, watching motivational videos where confident people tell you to just relax and believe in yourself. And every time, the same feeling shows up inside. Like you did something wrong again. Like anxiety is an enemy you just don't know how to defeat. And this is where the main mistake begins. All this time you haven't been fighting the problem. You've been fighting the signal. Imagine the engine warning light comes on in a car and you cover it with tape because it annoys you. It gets darker, quieter, but the engine doesn't get any better. That's roughly how you've been treating your brain. The value of this video isn't in teaching you how to get rid of anxiety. Quite the opposite. Here, we're going to break down why it appeared in the first place and what it's trying to tell you. Because anxiety isn't chaos. It's a very logical reaction of a rational system that sees more than you're used to admitting. When you start to understand this, something strange shifts inside. You stop being angry at yourself for what you feel. You stop seeing emotions as enemies. And instead of constant tension, clarity appears. Not lightness, not euphoria, but a calm sense of, I'm okay. I've just been looking in the wrong direction for a long time. The most freeing part of this approach is that it gives you control back. Not control through suppression, but control through understanding. You stop trying to become a different person, more convenient, more normal. You start figuring out how your mind works, your brain, your emotions and habits. And then it gets even more uncomfortable. Because if anxiety isn't the enemy, you'll have to ask an honest question. What in your life keeps bringing it back again and again? And are you ready to see it? From the very beginning, you were shown a simple script. If you're anxious, calm down. If you're scared, don't be weak. If there's chaos inside, pretend everything is under control. Society doesn't really like people whose emotions go beyond the acceptable range. They're hard to predict, inconvenient to manage, and they make others uncomfortable. So you were taught not to understand what's happening inside you, but to mute it. Keep yourself busy, switch off. Drown anxiety in TV shows, work, food, endless scrolling, anything as long as you don't have to be alone with the feeling. And you quickly learn the rule. If you're anxious, it means you're doing something wrong. But anxiety doesn't disappear. It just fades into the background. Like noise you get used to. You start living in constant inner tension and call it normal. You wake up already tired. You talk while simultaneously running a commentary on how you look from the outside. You build relationships while constantly fearing you'll say the wrong thing or be misunderstood. The paradox is that the harder you try to be calm, the stronger the anxiety becomes. Because you don't give it an outlet and you never ask the core question, what it's actually about. Instead of understanding, you choose control. Instead of a dialogue with yourself, you impose an inner ban. And this is where the meanings get twisted. You start thinking the problem is your psychology, your character, or weak willpower. When in reality, no one ever taught you how to use your own mind. No one taught you how to read the signals of your brain, your emotions, your body. You were taught to be convenient. This is an uncomfortable moment. It takes the guilt off you, but leaves the responsibility with you. If anxiety isn't a defect, but a suppressed signal, then from here on, you won't be suppressing it. You'll be listening. And that's exactly where the familiar picture starts to crack. Look around. You live in a world where the mind almost never gets to rest. Notifications, expectations, comparisons, other people's opinions, endless shoulds. Even when you're doing nothing, there's background noise inside, as if your mind is being kept in constant combat mode. In these conditions, anxiety stops being the exception and becomes the default response. In the past, anxiety kicked in during real danger. Now the danger is blurred. You don't know where you'll be in a year, whether you're good enough, whether you'll fall behind, whether you'll make the wrong choice. The mind doesn't like uncertainty, and when there's too much of it, it starts spinning scenarios, not because it wants to harm you, but because it's trying to protect you. Add to that a culture of constant evaluation. Social media, ratings, likes, comparisons of success. It's like you're always taking an invisible exam. Even rest turns into a task. Rest properly, efficiently, productively. In this mode, the mind doesn't calm down. It just switches the topic of anxiety. The most insidious part is that you start seeing this as a personal flaw. You think others are coping better, that they have a simpler mind or a stronger character. But the reality is different. The modern environment actively squeezes anxiety out of people with developed thinking, high sensitivity, and the habit of looking ahead. So the question isn't why you're anxious. The question is how you manage to stay sane at all in a world that demands you be attentive, fast, confident, and calm at the same time. And if your mind resists, maybe it's simply refusing to pretend that everything is fine. If we strip it down to the simplest level, anxiety doesn't begin with emotions. It begins with attention. Your mind is constantly scanning reality for what could go wrong. That's its basic function. The problem starts when attention gets stuck in the future and almost never returns to the present. You're walking down the street, everything seems calm, but inside, you're already replaying a conversation that hasn't happened yet. You're preparing for a meeting while simultaneously worrying about how it will end. The mind lives one step ahead of the body, and the smarter, more sensitive, and more observant you become, the farther ahead it runs. Anxiety isn't fear itself. It's an attempt at control. The mind models scenarios to protect you from pain, shame, rejection, mistakes. It creates tension because it believes tension is useful. In its logic, it's better to stay alert than to be caught off guard. But there's a subtle point. When you live in anticipation mode for too long, the mind loses its sense of completion. It never gets the signal the danger has passed. So the tension doesn't release. It becomes background. You get used to it, like a ringing in your ears, and start to think that this is who you are. And that's where the illusion appears. That anxiety is part of your character, that you're just that kind of person. When in reality, it's a learned thinking strategy, reinforced by habits, emotions, and constant analysis. The mind simply doesn't know where else to direct its power. Understanding this changes a lot. Because if anxiety is a way attention works, it can't be broken or switched off. It can only be redirected. And that's exactly what we'll talk about next. At some point, it's important to stop and ask yourself an uncomfortable question. What if anxiety isn't a malfunction but a form of energy? Not an enemy, but fuel that's been used the wrong way for a long time. Because in terms of intensity, anxiety feels very similar to interest, engagement, and inner readiness to act. Think about how anxiety feels in the body. Tension, focus, heightened attention, racing thoughts. This isn't a state of apathy, it's a state of mobilization, just without direction. As if you've been revved up, but never told where to run. And so the energy starts spinning in circles, turning into restlessness. Often anxious people are those with a high inner demand. They need to understand, to feel meaning, to see a direction forward. When that's missing, the mind keeps working anyway, searching, analyzing. And if reality doesn't give that energy an outlet, it starts eating away from the inside. In popular psychology, anxiety is often labeled a dysfunction. But if you look deeper, it's not a breakdown, it's a conflict between what your mind is capable of and how you're actually living, between inner potential and external expression. And the brain responds the only way it knows how, by creating tension. The most dangerous moment is when you start feeling ashamed of this energy. You hide it, suppress it, label it as weakness, because suppressed energy doesn't disappear. It either turns into chronic anxiety or finds an outlet in destructive forms. Burnout, irritability, sudden emotional crashes. If you see anxiety as a defect, you end up fighting yourself. If you begin to see it as strength, a different question appears. Where exactly are you not allowing it to go? And that's where a truly adult conversation begins. There are people who experience the world as if it's turned up to a higher volume. You walk into a room and immediately catch the mood. You hear not just the words, but the pauses between them. You notice when someone's smile doesn't quite reach the end, or when they say one thing while thinking another. And all of this happens automatically without effort. And this is an important moment not to rush past, because This is exactly where most people draw the wrong conclusion. This is how a hypersensitive mind works. It's not mysticism or a delicate emotional nature. It's a brain that processes signals quickly, connects details, and reaches conclusions before you even have time to consciously register them. In relationships, communication, and work, this can be a huge advantage if you understand what to do with it. The problem begins when you stop trusting your perception. You feel tension but convince yourself you imagined it. You notice inconsistencies but try to be convenient. And every time you do that, an inner conflict forms. Your mind sees one thing, and you force yourself to live as if you don't. In this case, anxiety is a side effect of overload. Too many signals, too little honest response to them. You absorb everything, but express almost nothing. And the energy of perception gets stuck inside, turning into restlessness and doubt. The irony is that people like this are often the ones who see themselves as weak, when in reality, their problem isn't a lack of strength. It's a lack of permission to use it. When you don't use sensitivity as a tool, it starts using you. Realizing this changes a lot. You stop asking why you're this way, and you start asking a different question. In which moments did you stop trusting your own mind and begin living against it? Anxiety often disguises itself as responsibility. You tell yourself you're just thinking ahead, trying to anticipate everything, be prepared. On the surface, it sounds reasonable. But if you listen honestly, it feels like constant tension inside, like gripping the steering wheel too tightly, even on an empty road. And now comes a point that almost no one connects to anxiety. Control is how the mind tries to feel safe. When you don't know what comes next, the mind attempts to take control of the situation, at least internally. It runs scenarios, looks for mistakes, rehearses conversations and decisions. The problem is that this control often has no outlet in action. You're always preparing, but rarely allowing yourself to go all the way. And this is where anxiety stops being fear and turns into anger directed inward. You can see it in small things. You spend a long time thinking about what to write and end up not writing at all. You plan a conversation, then postpone it. You analyze how people might react and choose the safest, most neutral option, or none at all. The control stays inside, never turning into action. And then it starts to press in on you. Because control without action doesn't calm the mind. It accumulates. The mind stays in waiting mode, never receiving a signal of completion. It doesn't know when it's allowed to relax because nothing was fully lived through. Over time, you start confusing caution with safety. You think that if you think everything through, it'll get easier. But the opposite happens. The more you try to keep everything under control internally, the less freedom you feel externally. In situations like this, anxiety isn't the fear of taking a step. It's the mind's irritation with itself for being endlessly prepared, but rarely acting. And until this cycle is broken, the tension will keep returning. Again and again. There's a myth you may have believed in for years, that you're simply a calm person, non-confrontational, rational, someone who knows how to keep themselves in check. And on the outside, that's exactly how it looks. You don't raise your voice, you try to understand others, you smooth things over. But inside, there's often a feeling that something is compressed and not allowed to come out. And this is where self-deception begins. Suppressed emotions rarely look like breakdowns, or hysterics. More often, they disguise themselves as fatigue, anxiety, and an inner heaviness. You're angry, but you call it irritation. You're hurt, but you tell yourself it's not worth dramatizing. You feel resentment, but convince yourself you should be above it. Every time you don't allow yourself to feel and express an emotion, the mind takes note. It understands that the direct route is blocked, and it starts looking for a detour. And very often that detour becomes anxiety, not as a single emotion, but as a background state, a constant inner tension without a clear object. This is especially noticeable in relationships. You endure, adapt, stay silent, and then catch yourself feeling unexplained anxiety around a certain person, as if the body knows more than you're willing to admit. And instead of having an honest conversation, you start dissecting yourself, searching for the problem inside. The paradox is that suppressing emotions looks like maturity only from the outside. On the inside, it's always a conflict, because emotions aren't weakness, they're signals. And if you ignore them for long enough, they stop knocking and start pressing. And at that point, anxiety stops being a mystery. It becomes a logical consequence of a life filled with too much that's left unsaid. And until this is noticed, the mind will keep reminding you of it in the most unpleasant way. When anxiety becomes background noise, you start looking for an explanation. And more often than not, you look in the wrong place. You read descriptions, watch videos, try on labels, anxiety disorder, low self-esteem, childhood trauma. Sometimes this really does clarify things, but more often it quietly leads you into a trap. And this is the point where psychology starts to do harm. Self-diagnosis gives you a sense of control. It feels like you found the cause, and you calm down for a moment. But at the same time, you lock yourself into the role of someone with a problem. You begin listening to every state, tracking your anxiety levels, checking whether something has intensified. And the more closely you observe, the louder the background noise becomes. Gradually, the focus shifts. You stop asking what in your life is actually creating the tension. It's easier to believe it's just the way your psyche works or the result of the past. Because then you don't have to change anything in the present. You don't have to take risks, make uncomfortable moves, say things that might break something. The most subtle part is this. Anxious people are often very honest with themselves. They're willing to analyze, admit weaknesses, dig deeper than others. And that very honesty starts working against them when it turns into constant self-monitoring instead of action. At some point, you know almost everything about your anxiety except the most important thing. What you need it for right now. What it's holding you back from. What step it's protecting you from taking. And until that question is asked, any diagnoses remain just words. The mistake of self-diagnosis isn't in wanting to understand yourself. It's in searching for the problem inside, instead of looking at your life as a whole. And from here, the conversation gets even less comfortable. There's one thing people rarely say out loud, and if you lose focus now, what follows may sound like just philosophy. Anxious people often aren't imagining things. They're noticing patterns. Their minds quickly connect details, pick up on recurring signals, and sense where things are heading long before it becomes obvious to others. This isn't foresight. It's the brain's ability to process information ahead of time. You can be in a situation that looks fine on the outside, yet feel tension inside. not because you're overthinking, but because something doesn't add up. A tone, a pause, a shift in behavior, small signals. You feel the direction even if you can't immediately put the reason into words. And this is why being right doesn't make it easier. Society prefers simple reactions. Be happy when everything is fine. Calm down when there's no clear threat. And when you sense anxiety before others do, you're told you're overcomplicating things. Over time, you start doubting your own perception and learn to stay silent. But a mind that sees ahead doesn't switch off. It keeps working alone without being supported by your actions. And then anxiety becomes background noise. Not because you're afraid, but because you know more than you allow yourself to admit. This is especially clear in relationships and at work. You stay in places where internally you already understand everything. Because it's not the right time, it's inconvenient, I just need to endure. And in that moment, anxiety is the last form of honesty you have left. It's not anxiety that's hurting you. The pain comes from silence, where you've long understood the truth, and this is where the entire conversation reaches its climax. At some point, anxiety stops being scary and starts being exhausting. You're no longer waiting for an attack. You're just living in constant tension, as if a waiting mode is always switched on inside, and you can't remember the last time you truly relaxed. Not in your body, but in your mind. You don't get tired of events. You get tired of yourself, of the need to control everything, feel everything, understand everything. Of the fact that even in calm moments, there's an inner dialogue in you running, analysis checking. You laugh with people, but part of your attention is always turned inward, monitoring your state, your words, your reactions. Over time, a strange sense of detachment appears, as if you're not living your own life, but a version that's supposed to be convenient and correct. You do what you should, communicate the way it's accepted, think the way it's proper. And the harder you try to fit in, the stronger the inner tension grows. The frustration here is quiet. No dramatic scenes, it's a fatigue that's hard to explain. When everything seems fine, yet inside there's emptiness and heaviness at the same time, you start thinking the problem is you, that you're ungrateful or too demanding of life. But the truth is different. You're not tired because something is wrong with you. You're tired because you've lived too long in a mode of self-restraint, and anxiety at this point isn't the enemy. It's a signal that you've reached a limit, that you can't keep going like this, even if everything looks stable on the outside. This is the point where many people either retreat fully into suppression or begin to truly listen to themselves. And this is exactly where the most important turn in this conversation begins. There's a moment when something suddenly clicks inside. Not from relief, but from clarity. You start to see that all this time you've been treating yourself like a problem that needs fixing. Fix the anxiety. Smooth out the emotions. Make yourself simpler. And the harder you tried, the tighter the inner compression became. Compression is the right word because you're not empty or weak. Quite the opposite. There's a lot of energy, attention, sensitivity, ideas inside you, but all of it has been kept under pressure for a long time. You've been holding yourself back, not because you want to, but because you're used to it, because at some point it felt safer that way. The realization doesn't come as excitement, but as a quiet, oh. You suddenly understand that anxiety isn't a separate part of you. It's the result of constant self-control. You're always making yourself smaller so you won't disturb, stand out, or create tension, and the mind pays for that with background unease. At this point, the question, how do I get rid of this, disappears. It simply becomes irrelevant because you begin to see the source, not in brain chemistry, not in your character, but in a way of life where your inner volume has been squeezed too tight. And that changes how you relate to yourself. You stop feeling ashamed of anxiety. You start to respect the fact that you endured so many years in a compressed state, without explosions, without destruction, just quietly on the inside. This isn't an ending or a solution. It's a moment of honesty. The first time you look at yourself, not as someone broken, but as someone who has needed more space for a long time. And after that, it's impossible to pretend you didn't see it. After this realization, something shifts. Not on the outside, but inside. Not instantly, not dramatically. The tension just stops being constant. You still feel anxiety, but it no longer looks like chaos. It becomes understandable, like a signal you've finally stopped muting. You start noticing moments where you used to automatically shrink, where you agreed, even though inside it was a no, where you stayed silent, even though you felt it was important to speak. And each time you choose a little more honesty with yourself, the energy that used to turn into anxiety comes back to you. It feels strange, like you're becoming more alive, a bit sharper, more direct, more sensitive. Not always comfortable, not always smooth. But for the first time in a long while, there's a sense of ground beneath you. You stop constantly monitoring yourself and start being present. It's important to understand. This isn't about turning into a confident person for motivational videos. It's about alignment. When your thoughts, emotions, and actions are no longer pulling in different directions, and the mind finally gets what it needs: completion. At this point, anxiety doesn't disappear completely. It changes shape. Instead of being background noise, it becomes a marker. It points out where you've started shrinking again, where you're trying to be someone else. And that's no longer frightening because you understand where it's coming from. The return of energy isn't a surge, it's a leveling. When you're no longer spending strength on suppressing yourself. And in this state, a quiet, adult confidence appears. Not because everything is under control, but because you're no longer at war with your own mind. This is where the most uncomfortable part begins. Anxiety rarely appears out of nowhere. More often it shows up where you have an intention, but you don't allow it to turn into action. You want to change something, say something, choose differently, and you stop yourself again and again. An intention isn't always something big. Sometimes it's a simple inner impulse to leave a conversation, to say no, to ask, to set a boundary, to take a step toward what actually matters. And every time you suppress it, the energy doesn't disappear. It stays inside, turning into tension. The mind works in a simple way. If there's an impulse with no outlet, it creates pressure. That pressure is what you call anxiety, not because you're afraid, but because you're stuck between what you feel and what you allow yourself to do. That's where the sense that anxiety is about nothing comes from. On the surface, everything is fine, but inside, there's no peace. Because the issue isn't the situation. It's an unlived choice, a decision you keep postponing, even though you already know the answer. This is especially clear in long-term anxiety, not sharp episodes, but the kind that drags on for months. There's almost always one suppressed "I want" or "I can't do this anymore" that you keep avoiding, and the mind keeps reminding you until you look straight at it. This idea is uncomfortable because it gives you your power back, and with it, responsibility. If anxiety is suppressed intention, then the path to clarity isn't through calming down, but through honesty. And here we arrive at a choice many people prefer to turn away from. At this point, the familiar approach to anxiety starts to fall apart. Because if it isn't a malfunction, then there's nothing to fix. There's no broken mechanism that needs urgent repair. There's energy, attention, intention, and the question of where you're directing all of it. Most strategies for fighting anxiety are built around one desire: to become quieter, to feel less, think less, react less. But imagine you've spent your whole life trying to lower the volume instead of tuning the signal. No wonder it hasn't worked. When you start directing instead of suppressing, the focus shifts. You stop asking how to get rid of anxiety and start asking what it's pointing to. Where you once again chose convenience over honesty. Where you held back an action that's long been ready. Direction always involves risk, the possibility of losing someone's approval, comfort, or stability. That's exactly why anxiety keeps you stuck for so long. It's as if it's saying, if you don't move on your own, I'll keep reminding you, louder and louder. And here's the paradox. When you take small but precise steps toward your intention, anxiety doesn't increase. It weakens. Not because things become safer, but because they become more truthful. The mind finally sees a connection between impulse and action. In that moment, you begin to feel the difference between calm as suppression and calm as clarity. The second doesn't promise comfort, but it gives you a sense of inner alignment. And that's the state your anxiety has been trying to lead you toward all along. If you put everything we've talked about together, the picture becomes simpler and more honest. Your mind didn't break down. It isn't too weak or too anxious. It just spent a long time working in compensation mode, covering for things you didn't allow yourself to experience directly. Anxiety showed up where there was attention without action, sensitivity without expression, intention without a step. The mind filled the gap with tension because it never received closure. And the smarter, deeper, and more observant you were, the more noticeable this effect became. You're not anxious by nature. You're someone with developed thinking, strong emotions, and a habit of analyzing. In healthy conditions, that brings clarity, intuition, and stability. Under constant self-restraint, it turns into background unease. There's one important thing to see. Anxiety isn't an enemy, and it isn't a diagnosis. It's a form of communication, a way for the mind to reach you when you stop listening to yourself. It intensifies not when something is wrong with you, but when you've been living out of alignment with yourself for too long. When this becomes clear, the unnecessary drama fades. Not because problems disappear, but because context appears. You stop drowning in sensations and start reading them. And that's a fundamentally different level of contact with yourself. This perspective doesn't make life easier, but it makes it more honest. And from this point on, anxiety stops running your life. It remains a signal, one you now know how to decode. At this point, it's important to pause and lock in the main idea. Anxiety doesn't disappear just because you've understood everything. It doesn't switch off at the push of a button, but it stops being something hostile. You no longer see it as proof of your inadequacy or weakness. You begin to treat anxiety as a signal, not an urgent one, not a panicked one, but a functional one. It shows up where you've drifted away from yourself again, where you settle for less than what you feel, where you choose the familiar over what's alive. And now, you can see it. That changes the inner dialogue. Instead of "something is wrong with me," a different question appears. Where am I being dishonest with myself right now? Not in an accusatory tone, but calmly. Like an adult who wants to understand, not punish themselves. The calm we're talking about here doesn't look like relaxation. It isn't the absence of tension. It's a sense of orientation. You know where to look when things become uneasy inside. And that alone is enough to keep anxiety from taking over the entire space. What also matters is that you stop waiting for a perfect state before living. You act not because anxiety is gone, but because you understand its nature. And in that place, real confidence appears. Quiet, without performative strength, but stable. This isn't the end of the story or a magical solution. It's a shift in relationship. When anxiety stops being a verdict and becomes part of a dialogue with yourself. And from here, there's only one last step left. Now you have a choice. Not a loud or dramatic one, a very quiet one. You can try once again to silence the anxiety, pretend you've understood everything, and move on as before. Or you can keep one question with you and return to it from time to time, whenever things feel uneasy inside. Not "what's wrong with me?" and not "how do I get rid of this?" but something much more precise. Where am I squeezing myself right now? Where do I know, but don't act? Where do I feel, but choose silence? This question doesn't demand immediate decisions. It's simply honest. Maybe you won't answer it today, and that's okay. Sometimes it's enough to stop running from the feeling and allow it to be there. Not as a problem, but as a directional sign. Anxiety doesn't make you weak. It shows that your mind is alive, sensitive, and unwilling to live at half capacity. And if you start listening to it not as an enemy, but as a signal, many things begin to fall into place on their own. The final thought is simple, but uncomfortable. Anxiety appears where you've stopped being honest with yourself. And it doesn't disappear when you become calmer, but when you become yourself.